Hi, my name is Natalie Nava, Keep Forth Beautiful Coordinator, and on behalf of the program, I'd like to introduce Laura Miller, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Agent.
Hi, I'm here to talk to you today about composting. Did you know that you can take your kitchen trash and turn it into the garden treasure? Today we're going to talk about how to divert that waste from the landfill and create something that you can use to grow plants for yourself. What is composting? That's what we're here to talk about. I'm Laura Miller, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and I'm here to talk to you about composting. Composting will happen no matter what you do, but the things we're going to talk about today will allow you to do it more efficiently and effectively and come out with that valuable resource that we can add to our gardens to improve everything from plant growth to soil structure. So why do we compost? Well, we look at it as mimicking what happens in nature. So if you think about a forest, on the floor of a forest, leaves and branches and debris are constantly falling, and that decomposes over time into nutrients, especially nitrogen, that feeds the forest plants. So we're just trying to recreate that natural cycle. That natural cycle is so valuable because every time that rain falls on that decomposing organic material, it will release nitrogen and other nutrients into your soil. And that will provide the nutrition that your plants need, and you'll have healthier, better growing plants. So there are lots of benefits to adding compost and organic material to soil. You will attract earthworms and other beneficial organisms. You will also increase your soil water holding capacity while improving the internal drainage of your soil. Seems kind of like a miracle, and it really is. Whether your soil is very clay-based like many of our soils in Fort Worth, or sandier like some of the soils in the eastern part of town, those soils will be better in structure with increased organic material from compost. You'll also have better nutrient retention and more available nitrogen for your plants. Now, there's really only two rules to composting. You pile it up and you let it rot. That will happen no matter what you do. So we're really only talking about how to do it more efficiently. You can make compost in a pile or a bin. A home compost pile or bin does need to be big enough to heat up and to stay moist, but not so big that you can't turn it and that it would be poorly aerated over time. So generally we talk about 3 to 5 feet in all dimensions. Now, there are many types of bins. You can make your own bin or you can purchase a bin. This photograph shows several different options. One simple one is to make a bin out of wire. The advantages of this type of bin are that more air flows through the compost. The advantages of a wooden bin may be that you have some wooden materials you want to recycle, like pallets. This photograph shows a 3-bin system, which is a good system for composting. In a 3-bin system, you start with your new compost in one bin, and then as it decomposes, you move it down the line into the next bin, and then the next bin as it finishes, and you can start a whole new bin of compost as you're working along. On the bottom of this slide, there are 2 different kinds of bins that you can purchase. One is a round bin that you can turn. This is to help you keep the compost aerated and moist. It's a little harder to do in real life than it seems like it would be based on the picture. Compost can be kind of heavy, especially if it's fairly moist compost. In the bottom right-hand corner of this slide are some purchased recycled plastic bins. These are nice because they do hold up over time. They themselves won't decompose, and also because they keep your compost contained and kind of out of sight and out of mind. So, you want to start by setting up your bin. Select a spot to set it up that's out of the way. You may not want to make this the focal point of your landscape, but convenient to reach. You want to have plenty of room around the bin, and you want to be close to a source of water. My bin is outside my kitchen door. I like having it there because it's easy for me to take out kitchen scraps and also to take out coffee grounds and coffee filters as I generate those. When you build a compost bin, you are going to, or fill the compost bin, you are going to have two different types of materials, and we classify those as green materials or brown materials. And the brown materials are higher in carbon, and the green materials are higher in nitrogen. You want to put them together so that you have a specific carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that carbon to nitrogen ratio should be about 30 to 1. So we're looking for materials that are kind of close to that 30 to 1. And then we're also trying to balance the materials that we put in our bin so that we end up with something close to 30 to 1. Some typical carbon sources that you might have handy are dried leaves, which is about a 60 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And every fall we get a nice supply of these. Other things you might want to use include newspaper or cardboard. Newspaper has a fairly low carbon to nitrogen ratio, about 25 to 1, so it's easily composted. Cardboard, on the other hand, is kind of difficult to compost, being fairly high carbon to nitrogen ratio, as is sawdust. We don't have a whole lot of pine needles in Tarrant County, but you can see that those have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than dried hardwood leaves. So for nitrogen sources, there's two categories. There's plant-based nitrogen sources and there's animal-based nitrogen sources. And it's okay to have a completely plant-based compost. You do not have to have animal manures in your compost. You can make good compost with only plant sources. Some of the plant-based sources are food scraps, vegetable trimmings, waste from your landscape when you pull weeds or trim your plants back. Those are all in that category that we would call food scraps, and their carbon to nitrogen ratio is about 12 to 15 to 1. So it's about, if you think about it, it's about half of that 30 to 1 that we're going for. Another thing that most of us, if you drink coffee or if you frequent a coffee place that gives away their coffee grounds, and many of them do, are coffee grounds. And coffee grounds are about a 20 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So you can see that they're fairly close to what you want to have in your compost bin. They are also already nicely ground up, and they're usually moist, so they're a pretty easy thing to compost, which is one of the reasons that most people do include them in a compost bin. Manures have compost carbon to nitrogen ratios of around, everything from 10 to 1 to 25 to 1, depending upon the type of manure that you're working with. Those definitely do help your compost move along more quickly, but as I said, you do not have to use animal manures in compost. There are some things you don't want to use in compost, and some of those would be pet manures. So those are not generally safe to use in compost. They may have some pathogens in them that you don't want to have in your compost. You also should not compost meat, bones, cheese, milk, fat or oils. Ashes, though you can spread ashes on the ground if you want to. They don't break down well in compost. And you don't want to include diseased plants from your landscape. If you think that a plant has a particular problem, you don't want to put that in your compost because that fungal or bacterial pathogen might be able to live in your compost, and then you'd be reapplying that to your landscape and therefore maybe spreading that disease. And finally, there are some herbicides that are persistent in compost, particularly aminopyrrolid and chloropyrrolid type herbicides. So if you know that your grass or some hay or some manure even that you have has been treated with those herbicides, or the hay has been treated with herbicides and animals have eaten treated hay, then you don't want to include that in compost because it will persist and could kill your plants. All right, there are two ways that you can create a bin. The first option is to fill the bin with alternating layers of brown and green ingredients. So you put in for example, a layer of dried leaves, and then you put in a layer of kitchen scraps. Those two layers are alternated, and you want to moisten each layer as you build them. The second option is to mix it all together and then throw it in the bin. So you want to shred up your leaves, you want to mix your green and brown materials, and then start putting them in the bin, moistening them as you go. Adding a little bit of soil or compost can be beneficial. You can mix that in. It will help increase the numbers of organisms in your compost. It's not necessarily, you probably are composting on the ground, on the soil, so organisms will come up from the soil into your bin. It is helpful though in getting things started. When you have everything layered in, you've got what we call a finished bin. You do want that bin to be full when you start composting. The microorganisms will go to work and they'll start breaking down all the ingredients in your compost. Temperature is pretty important for composting. As you might imagine, it's harder to get up to that good active composting temperature of 55 degrees to 155 degrees in the middle of winter. So sometimes we have temperatures that are pretty cold. Your compost will break down more slowly in those temperatures. On the other hand, sometimes we have temperatures that are definitely in that range of 55 to 155. The most effective range is 122 to 131, and thankfully we don't get quite that hot in the summer, but you'll notice that in the heat of the summer your compost does break down more quickly. It's good to get up into that 131 degree range because you will destroy more seeds and diseases in that range. Sometimes you'll be able to tell that you're not up in that range because you will see weeds or perhaps the occasional cantaloupe or watermelon sprouting in your compost bin, and you'll know that your temperatures are not quite that high. It's not really a problem, but it is beneficial to get up into that higher range. If you get up above 140 degrees or so, it's too hot for most bacteria and therefore decomposition will slow down. So you don't really need to get up that hot. A thermometer is a great tool, but you don't have to have it to do a good job composting. A compost thermometer has a really long stem so that it can reach down into the middle of the compost pile. You can also, of course, dig down into the middle of your pile and take its temperature with a regular kitchen thermometer if you want to. So how do you know when your compost is ready? Well, it will have changed quite a bit. The color will change, the temperature will cool back down to a normal ambient air temperature. It should have a nice earthy smell. It shouldn't smell like any kind of its original ingredients. It should contain no readily recognizable feedstock. So you shouldn't be able to see the shredded leaves or the kitchen waste or little pieces of sticks in your compost. It should all look like one fairly uniform material. And your compost pile will have shrunk to about 1/3 of its original volume. Some people feel that they work and work to build a big compost pile and then they get almost nothing out of it, and that's kind of almost true. That material is breaking down. The volume will be greatly reduced when the compost is ready. Sometimes you might want to sift your compost, especially if you do have some of those source materials in it, but you want to go ahead and use it. You can make a compost sifter by attaching a wooden frame to screen screening that compost will make a nice fine product that is good for use in beds or in containers. But you don't have to screen your compost. Now, what do you do if your compost bin, your compost pile doesn't get hot? Well, you can make compost in a pile that never gets hot, but it will be much slower. The things that you might need to add if your compost pile is not getting hot could be air. I always say that air is one of the things that you can never add too much of. It could be that you need to increase your carbon to nitrogen ratio, or actually decrease your carbon to nitrogen ratio. You have too many brown feedstuffs in your compost and you need a little bit more green. And you might have too much or too little water. So your compost should be moist, it shouldn't be dry, but it shouldn't be sopping wet. All of those things can slow down decomposition. A high temperature in your pile is the fastest way to get compost. It also will kill more of those disease-causing organisms that might be in the pile. And finally, it will kill weed seeds that are in the pile. Troubleshooting in your compost pile. If your compost pile doesn't smell right, it may be telling you what's wrong. So if you smell that putrid, rotten egg, sulfur smell, you are getting anaerobic versus aerobic decomposition. So there's not enough air in your pile. That could be because you have excess moisture. The way you can remedy that is to turn the pile, aerate it, add more air, and then also add some dry material, some dry leaves, some dry paper, something that will absorb a little bit of that moisture and balance it out a bit. On the other hand, sometimes you have the opposite problem. You have too many greens in your pile and you've got too much nitrogen and you'll have a smell that's a bit like ammonia or urine. What you want to do in that particular situation is add a little bit more brown material. So you want to add something like dry leaves, and you do want to turn the pile. This is your goal. This is compost. Smells good. It's beautifully dark in color and it's full of nutrients, and your plants will be so happy to see it. This is another method that you can use to compost. If you don't want to build a bin and you do have a vegetable garden with paths in it, this is a great way to compost. What you do is simply dump leaves in your compost, in your walkways in your garden. These leaves will break down and compost. You can also put kitchen waste or kitchen scraps in these walkways, but it's probably pretty good to make it mostly leaves. As those leaves compress, as you walk on them, you can add more and more. The compressed leaves create a nice walkway, a nice path in your garden, but they are also breaking down. You can speed up the process by adding a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer. You can also speed up the process with a rototiller, but you don't have to add fertilizer or rototill. And then when your leaves have broken down in your walkway, you can very easily, because they're located right next to your beds, shovel them up onto your garden. This is a really handy way to compost inside of your garden, and I do recommend it for anybody with a vegetable garden. So, keys to good composting: patience. Compost will happen. It's a great way to redeem all those waste products that you have around your yard, to take all of that organic material that your plants are providing and put it back to use in your soil.
Thank you so much, Laura, for sharing those awesome tips with us today, and hopefully you guys can utilize this information to make your own garden treasure.
For more information, visit aggiehorticulture.tamu.edu.